Hello, everybody, and welcome to Elections Daily's coverage of the special election in New Mexico's 1st District. We're happy to have you all on tonight as viewers. Myself, Joe, who will be with us doing election results and reporting as always, and Eric, who's always here for commentary. Kraz may also be joining us later. So we're going to start right off the bat with a little bit of a discussion. I'm going to introduce the race, talk about some data that I've compiled that I actually discussed earlier with Joe on the Old Bull TV series for Predict It. You can go watch that. We can put a link in the description later. But yes, we're going to introduce the race, and then I'll have some discussion between Joe, Eric, and myself before polls close at 9. So first off, as you all know, New Mexico's 1st District has a special election because former Congresswoman Deb Haaland resigned to take up a new cabinet spot within the Biden administration, two-term Congresswoman. Previously, representing the seat was Michelle Lujan Grisham, who is now the governor of New Mexico since winning that open governorship in 2018. And prior to that, the seat was represented by Martin Heinrich, who's now the Class 1 senator from New Mexico. Just a little bit of a trivia piece here. The last time that the 1st District was represented by a Republican was Heather Wilson, who won re-election in a very competitive race in, I believe it was 2008, eventually retired, and Martin Heinrich
ran for Senate in 2012, did very well, even though she didn't win.
Yep, and Heinrich took up the seat. So the 1st District has proven to be quite interesting. As you guys all know, with us here at Elections Daily, we did a joint poll with our good friends at RRH. A lot of you played a major role in that with your crowdfunding, and we really appreciate your dedication and commitment to helping fund a poll like that, which was the only poll in the race and has been cited by numerous very respected outlets, including NPR in an article this morning. So thank you all there. 538 as well. That poll showed Stansbury with a 16-point lead. The district did vote for Clinton by 17 points in 2016 and 23 points for Biden in 2020. So it is a Democratic district. And Democrats, if we look at the total early vote that we received with the 5 p.m. drop, as well as our election day votes, Democrats are leading both, which again should be expected because it's Democratic district. The two candidates here are State Representative Melanie Stansbury, the Democrat, and State Senator Mark Moores, both from Bernalillo County, which accounts for about 92% of the total vote in the district and is home to the majority of both the district's Republicans and Democrats. It's racially diverse, composed primarily around Albuquerque, which you guys know. And then there are a couple smaller counties in the district, the Republican portion of Santa Fe, Sandoval, and Torrance County. I said that wrong. Valencia is the Republican portion. Sandoval up north is that little Democratic portion there. Now I guess I'll move on before the discussion, just so we have a good majority of the time for panel discussion, to the data that I have for you guys here that I've compiled. First off, let me also mention here, if we want to look at I lost our poll results here, so I guess I'll show you that later. Let's start off here with sharing my screen. All right, so here I made this first of all. Again, if you look at the last House race here, Bernalillo County, which is the home of Albuquerque, made up almost 92% of the total votes cast. So again, really a make or break. What you have from the other counties is pretty much insignificant unless we get to somehow a race that's being decided by less than 1%, and a couple thousand votes really does matter. So Bernalillo matters a lot. Holmes, in her congressional run against Hollande in the last election, took 40.7% of the vote, and that's pretty good. That's roughly an average performance. If you look at the partisan breakdown of the county, it's pretty much 60-40 Democratic with some room for variance here. And what I did is I took the results from the last election and I basically made some hypotheticals that would affect the race as a whole here by margin. So again, the big thing for Republicans here is not winning this district, because we expect the district to be a Democratic lock. It is, after all, a Democratic district. What Republicans are really looking at is, can we shave off the margin for the Democrats? Can we get it below 18%? Can we get it even less than that? And if they have an amazing night, getting it below 10% would be very good. So just getting this race close would line up with what we saw in terms of the partisan breakdown in the Texas 6 race and would bode well for Republicans, on the other hand, Democrats want to perform very well here, match or exceed Biden's margin in the district. But again, if a Republican were to get, let's say, 45% of the vote in Bernalillo in the last House race and the rest remain the same, that's what you would need to get it under 10%. So either 44 to 45% in Bernalillo would get the margin overall under 10%. Although, again, this data has its limitations. Special election turnout is lower than the general election cycle, and we have 2 third-party candidates, including Aubrey Dunn, running on the ballot here as well. And finally, these 2 numbers, I'd like to point your attention to these 2. The first number here, and this is pursuant to voter statistics released at 5 p.m. from the Board of Elections. The first number is the total Democratic votes cast early in Election Day as a percentage of the Democratic votes cast in 2020. So at the moment, pursuant to the House race, the Democratic votes today are 45.7% of the Democratic votes cast in November, and the Republican votes 33.95% of the Republican total cast in November. Again, turnout expected to be lower, and again, third-party candidates. But I thought you guys would be interested to look at some of that data. And our little benchmark thing here, I'll be bringing this up throughout the night to pose to the panel as we really watch Bernalillo, which again is the bellwether county to watch here. If there's a county to watch, that's it in this district. So with that, thank you guys for dealing with that little introduction there. Now I'm going to throw it to our wonderful panel. First, I'll throw it off to Eric to hear his expectations tonight, and then I want to make sure I hear from Joe and Kraz as well. So go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, so real quick, I'll go ahead and show a couple of maps that I've made as well of New Mexico 1, because it's a very interesting district overall. This is not ancestrally Democratic. This is ancestrally Republican. So I was able to get precinct data thanks to help from C9 to RRH, who coincidentally, this is before we talked about doing a poll. So what it looks like basically is this is the presidential race in New Mexico first. You notice Bernalillo County is very blue. Especially if you zoom in right here, you'll notice these areas over here, the western portion of the county. This is the more Hispanic portion of the area, whereas the eastern one is the more white portion. And so that's why it's a little bit more conservative there. You'll notice that Joe Biden won the seat by 23. This is a really good performance for him in this district. The other 2 races were more competitive, though. The House election, Deb Hollande versus Michelle Garcia Holmes. Garcia Holmes actually did pretty well in the eastern portion or the western portion of the district, maybe because Hispanic ancestry or something along that line. But she outran Biden, or she outran Trump in the seat by a not insignificant margin. I mean, that's about a 4-point overperformance from her, just from Trump. If you account for Biden, him getting 60.8% compared to Hollande getting 58.2%, pretty decent swing. And finally, the Senate race saw the closest. No one really saw how competitive this race was until the very end. But ultimately, Marco Chetty was able to pull within, I think, 5-6% of the vote. And part of it was an overperformance in New Mexico 1. You'll notice he did better in these more traditionally white neighborhoods and areas in the eastern portion of Bernalillo County. So if there's an overperformance for Moores tonight, I would expect it to come from this portion of the district. And then finally, one more map that's useful here is a comparison of the presidential race and the Senate race. So this is, again, what you want to keep in mind when we're looking at. Again, so if you look at the numbers here, most of these just saw pretty small, saw 2 to 5% increase for Ron Chetty. But the biggest overperformances compared to Trump came from, again, the eastern portion of the county right here. Whereas the Democratic overperformances the Trump overperformance or the relative underperformance came from the more western portion with the Hispanic neighborhoods. So again, that's basically what I would go at. So I think, based on the early voting numbers, based on everything we've looked at, I don't think Republicans get within 10, and I'm not sure they get within 15. I think the Republican goal right now is to stay about even with Michelle Garcia Holmes' performance in the district, or ideally to get within 15. There had been outside talk of getting within 10 or 5 early on. That's kind of evaporated now. On the Democratic side, I see a lot of people wishing more like Democrat plus 22 or 24. And that's certainly possible, if you look at the early voting numbers. But I do think it'll be a little bit closer than that. I think it'll be at least closer than 20.
Joe, any brief thoughts before polls close?
Yeah, this isn't a race where we're looking for a winner or a loser. This is kind of unlike the Texas 06 special election when we were very uncertain about who we were going to see in the runoffs, and that ended up being Susan Wright and Jake Ellzey in a Republican versus Republican runoff that was kind of surprising for that night. But we know who's going to win tonight. Melanie Stansbury is going to be the next representative from New Mexico's 1st District. What we're really watching tonight, and we're going to really, I think, hammer this home, I think all of us on the stream tonight, is that we're going to be watching the margin. The margin is what's going to tell the story tonight. If it's around the same, or if it's a little bit above, Democrats are going to be pretty happy. If it's anything below, though, Democrats' margins, Deb Haaland's margin in 2020, you're probably going to see some Republicans pretty happy about that. This is not necessarily a super elastic district. It has a very, very high floor in recent times for Democrats. It's going to be hard to see. We've got less than 2 minutes till polls close, so we're going to hopefully start seeing some results soon. But it's going to be very interesting to see the margin night. That's really what we're focusing on, the margin, not the winner. Because Melanie, like I said, Melanie Stansbury, no doubt will be the next representative from this district.
And something that could contribute to the margin that I think we should touch on before polls close is how the Hispanic vote breaks down. And I think it would be interesting to follow up what Eric did with those precinct maps by showing you a map by miles here, if you haven't seen it already. And it basically compares the change presidentially by state house district from 2008 to 2020 against the percentage of the voting age population that is Hispanic in the Bernalillo portion of the 1st District. And as you can see, the 3 state house districts with the highest percentage of Hispanic population happen to also be 3 districts in which you saw the change with Obama outrunning there. So I think it's cool to look at this map too, just because I find it interesting. I think it plays a pretty big role in this election in particular, because we're looking primarily at Bernalillo County, and honestly, any vote the Republican could get is an important one. So not sure what you guys think about that, but.
Yeah, I actually have one more to show as well, just real quick. That's a bit of a trivia. The last time Republicans won statewide races in New Mexico, I believe, was 2014. And this is what it looked like. It did go Republican in that race and went to a little bit more of a Democratic margin than the actual statewide performance. Susana Martinez won by 15. I believe she won this district closer to 10. So it is a little bit more Democratic than the state as a whole, but that's mainly because this big district at the bottom, the rural district, is really the Republican stronghold and where those Republican votes come from. So that's just a little bit of trivia right there.
Some more trivia, actually. Just right before we start, some trivia. It's funny because Stansbury and Moores both got elected to the legislature, defeating an incumbent of the opposite party.
Yeah, in districts, in Moore's case, he actually flipped a district that Biden won. He's in a Biden won district.
Yep.
That's why people thought he was a quality candidate. And I still think he's a pretty good candidate for the seat. It's because he was in a district that Biden won. It's a very challenging thing to do, comparing a state level race with a more federal level race. It's easier to win. And certainly the district was not as Democratic as this one. I believe it was closer to like a Biden plus 3 or 4. One of those white suburban seats.
We have our spread and predictions as well on the post that we had. I think that the smallest margin that someone predicted is like D plus 5. The biggest margin is D plus 25. So we're going to have to see. But you guys keep submitting your predictions because polls have closed, and we'll be waiting on Joe for updates as we go along. Also be comparing against the benchmark notes that I wrote, and I'll make sure to zoom in a bit more next time. And we'll be using the live mapping from our good friends at RRH Elections who helped us. In fact, we're responsible via our partnership with getting that poll really going through the meat and potatoes of it, getting it out to the public. So
and yeah, we're actually surprised by how many people are on right now. I think we're close to 100 viewers at the moment, which we were not expecting for a race of this one with the result being a foregone conclusion. So
if it's funny, it's more than we had for the Georgia runoffs and last November. One.
But yeah, we're happy you guys are here, and we don't know how long this will be until we figure out the entire results of this race or get a good picture of where things are going. But it will be when those Bernalillo results come in. That will be a pretty good indication, given how much of the seat is based in that county, which is virtually all of the districts.
All of it. I mean, the only way the other portions will matter is if somehow this becomes like a Pennsylvania 2018, and somehow like the Republicans win or
you have a bunch of where you have a bunch of Biden voters, registered Democrats going for for Moores. We don't expect that to happen. We do still have this race as likely Democratic. I don't think we ever shifted it from safe. But again, we do expect Melanie Stansbury to win this race quite considerably. Before we do go into results when they start coming in, just a quick plug. We do have a Patreon. If you like what we're doing, you can go there and subscribe. We have a Discord server and some other things. If you like it, go there, subscribe. If not, if you don't want to do that, then that's fine. Just continue watching our content. We appreciate that you're here. But I figured I'd throw that in there since we have a little bit of dead time here before these results start rolling in. Because the polls did close 2 minutes ago. Speaking of dead time, I'd also like to direct you to the RRH site here, and I'll post the link in here because they, thanks to Cynic there, CINYC9, does some great mapping for RRH for all of these special elections. So go visit. In the meantime, I'll let you see some of it. So he's plugged in the precinct results for the 2020 president, as you can see here, but also the 2020 House result as well. And you can see pretty well in Bernalillo County that overperformance by Holmes. Holmes did outrun Trump, and that's where you get that deficit. There's a closer race for House. So, Ron Chetty, Mark Moores, if he's looking at this map, will say, can we hit this if we want to make it a close race, which he would need to do. He needs to get that 45% in Bernalillo, which is 5% more than Holmes. And to do that, you're kind of looking at this map as groundwork and moving up to see how can we get this map and improve off of it if you want to make it a race under 10 points. And for reference here, CNC9 is the RRH is using the same data for the presidential and House races that I calculated. We calculated them together and worked on it. So this is the same data I showed you in the map before of the presidential and the House result, just with a little bit of a different color scheme. But you can explore it yourself, and you can explore it yourself and look at all those details in however manner you like. Go ahead, Joe. Update.
Well, I just not a great type of update, but I just saw a tweet come across my feed from the great Steve Kornacki. Kornacki has confirmed that we are expecting to see results from Bernalillo dropping in just under 30 minutes. So by 9:30, folks, we should start to see some big numbers start to come in because, again, as Harrison has mentioned before, Bernalillo is the biggest county in this seat. It is basically the only population density in this seat. So biggest city in the state of New Mexico for that. Biggest city is Albuquerque. So biggest city in the state of New Mexico. So in about by 9:30, we should at least start to see some big results from Albuquerque and Bernalillo County. And I think, we can talk a little bit about where New Mexico is at the moment because it's a pretty interesting state. This is a state that Bush almost carried twice. A large Hispanic population that swung to Trump, but it was still a Biden plus 11 state. It was closer in the Senate race. Republicans have looked at the previous results here and have looked at the Hispanic nature of the state, how rural a lot of it is, and have considered it, I think, a future swing opportunity. Definitely not this election, but in future decades. They're hoping to whittle it back down to where it was several decades ago, which is being more of a competitive state. But I think to do that, they'll need to either break into those more Hispanic cities downstate, because Bernalillo County is one of the reasons we were very competitive in New Mexico for a while. They were very competitive in the county. In 2004, Bush lost the county, but he only lost by about 4 points. This is actually even worse than he did in 2000, but he made it up for in the rest of the state. But the problem is now this is a county that went for Joe Biden 61-37. Like the district as a whole, because again, this district is almost all of it, aside from a native reservation, along with a few other counties. So to be more competitive in places like New Mexico, they're going to need to either claw back in Bernalillo County and its suburbs, or get into the Native American rural areas or the Hispanic areas. It's a bit of a challenge for them long term, in my opinion. In fact, like you said, if you want to look at the Bernalillo problem for the Republicans overall, given the fact that it was really once a stronghold for the GOP, if you compare the 2020 Senate race against 2014, and keep in mind that Mark Ronchetti did very well for a modern-day Republican in a New Mexico Senate race, got over 45% of the vote, did better than most analysts expected, but one of the few counties in the whole state that did shift toward the Democrats, and keep in mind these are Atlas colors, was Bernalillo County. So
If that doesn't
Yeah.
tell you there's a problem, there certainly is a little problem here.
Yeah, and for reference, retiring Senator Tom Udall won the state by 11.2% in 2014, which is a good margin. In 2020, the margin was only 5.1 or 6.1%, which is again much closer than a lot of other so-called competitive districts. But again, when you're even with that improvement, that decline came in those traditionally white, college-educated Republican areas, and not only in Albuquerque, but also places like Los Alamos and other more suburban areas where Republicans used to be much stronger. It's a challenge for them. It's not one that's impossible to overcome. If they got within 6 in a presidential election where their presidential candidate was losing by 11, it's certainly possible that they can get a little bit closer. Jacob Smith has a good question here. Why is it shaped the way it is? I would assume that choice was made. I'm not sure if it was a Republican or a Democratic decision, to be honest. At the time the governor was in 2010, I believe the governor was a Republican, Susana Martinez, so she won the election in 2010. So I would assume she had a say in redistricting. Might have put those in there to make it more Republican, or alternatively, Democrats may have just decided it to be drawn the way it is. Ultimately, I don't think the decision, how it's shaped, which kind of looks like a dog, I really don't think it was a partisan decision either way, because honestly, those other areas don't impact the actual vote total of the seat much. I think it was honestly probably just a population balance sort of thing, but I'm really not sure why it's shaped the way it is. It's definitely an unusually shaped district.
And honestly, they kind of just kept the same layout as before, because all 5 of the counties that are in it now were also in the district that was drawn in 2002. And pretty much the same shape. I think it just lost a little bit of Valencia County, but other than that, pretty much the same. But to touch back on what you said about Ron Chetty, who got about 40.5% in Bernalillo, which is about what Holmes got in her House race. It's really, can Republicans get above 40%? Because as I mentioned on the benchmark thing that I'll show later in the night as we get results, if you get anywhere, I mean, even if you got 45%, which would be very, very strong performance, that would get it under 10 points theoretically, although we have to account for third parties. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah, any draw of the district that was reasonable would split counties, because it does have a smaller population, as someone mentioned in the comments, than the ideal district in the state. So that's definitely also one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is the native tribes. Keep in mind that the tribes don't want to be split up. They want to mostly be in the same district. This ensures they have maximum voting power in the 3rd congressional district to choose not necessarily the candidate of their choice, but to have a major say in who that candidate would be. Because most of the voters for the Republican side are white voters in that district. So that's also a decision here as to how you draw that, is keeping the tribes happy. It's also a reason I'm not actually sure New Mexico would have a gerrymander this cycle, because there's ways you can draw a New Mexico map that is gerrymandered, but it's difficult to make one where Republicans are locked out without splitting up the tribes. And that's a no-go. That's something that New Mexico Democrats would not want to breach. That would just not be a very wise decision on their part. Oh yeah, Kraz, I believe he has an answer to one of the questions about Ron Chetty.
Yeah, so someone in the comments asked, why did Ron Chetty do so well in 2020? He kind of came out of nowhere. So we didn't really see him doing that well. We had heard some mumbling that maybe he was stronger than expected. Really what we think it came down to was Ben Ray Lujan was not running a spirited campaign. He likely thought he had it in the bag from the start. Also, Ron Chetty wasn't a total nobody. Ron Chetty was a prominent weatherman and news anchor from I believe the Albuquerque area, actually. So this district.
That's why he did better in the wider suburban areas of that county.
Right. So I think it was probably a combination of things. Democrats' attention was elsewhere, and they didn't see the Hispanic shift coming. And so that hit particularly hard in New Mexico, where not only are there a lot of Hispanic voters, but they were basically paying no attention. They thought they had it in the bag for sure. Ben Ray Lujan probably ran not the best campaign, and Ron Chetty had some things going for him in terms of just his general profile and his prominence because of his career on local news.
And I think
And there's
we
a couple other reasons. Oh,
seen
sorry.
in the primary, I was just going to say we should have seen it coming because if you remember, I thought it was hilarious that the media markets by county lined up exactly with Ron Chetty's primary coalition.
But yeah, I mean, one thing I want to mention here is that obviously I think Democratic attention being elsewhere did matter here. Democrats were chasing, whales in South Carolina, in Kansas, in Kentucky, in Mississippi. If this election had been like maybe a Trump win, this is a sort of race that can definitely fall out from underneath you, not noticing the sort of race, like in North Dakota in 2012, where you thought you had it in the bag, and then the last week you get surprised all of a sudden. One thing I do want to mention though with Ron Chetty that did help him is a personal connection he had. Ben Ray Lujan's attacks on him were predominantly on healthcare. Ben Ray Lujan specifically attacked him on healthcare as an issue. The problem is Mark Ron Chetty has a daughter with a pre-existing condition. And obviously having a personal connection to the healthcare issue and being able to say, my daughter has a pre-existing condition, I would not support any healthcare plan that kicks my daughter off. That, I think, from everything I've heard, was an effective attack against Lujan, running more of a single-issue healthcare campaign. It really wasn't effective when he had that personal response of having a family member with that sort of personal connection. We saw, we've seen Republicans, be able to draw a little more on that with issues like race and to some degree disability. Candidates like Dale Crafts in Maine, being able, or even to some degree Madison Cawthorn in North Carolina 11, being able to at least, talk about being not necessarily in the in group or in a position like that. But I think Ron Chetty was really uniquely positioned because New Mexico is not an affluent state. It's one of the poorer states in the country, relatively speaking, and it's rural. Having a connection like that, I think, does count. It was really a perfect storm to be a competitive race. The problem is New Mexico is not what it was 20 years ago. If it's 20 years ago, Ron Chetty probably is able to pull a much closer race or even pull an upset. Now it's very difficult to do in a Biden plus 11 state. It's just a little bit too far, I think. And for those who are wondering, we're still waiting for the results to come in. Mm-hmm. Steve Kornacki said that the election reporter, you've definitely heard of him, also newly signed sports consultant, sports statistic analyst for
he's making millions now.
Yeah, which is really good. The sports stuff is fantastic. I wouldn't advertise this election analysis over ours personally. That's kind of our thing. But he said the results should come within about 30 minutes. And that was probably about 10 minutes ago that he said that. And obviously when Bernalillo comes in, we'll have a very good indication of how this district is going to vote because it is the brunt of the district. We've mentioned this multiple times. It is most of the district.
And again, looking at the live map, if we see pretty early that Mark Moores is clearly underperforming the percentages that Holmes got in some of these precincts outrunning Trump in 2020, then I think that's a pretty early indication that we're going to have a Bernalillo performance that's either at or below the Holmes performance, which would line up with Trump's numbers, which would pretty much indicate that this will be a race that's decided by a similar margin to the presidential race, so at 20-ish points. But if you're seeing it above, we can see the other way around. So again, crucial Bernalillo County.
Mm-hmm. And I actually want to answer a question here real quick because I think this is interesting. There could be some interesting discussion off this. So one of our contributors, Aaron Goldsmith, asked a good question, which is, what do you think of media personalities that cover news standing for office? This actually isn't a new thing. This is actually somewhat common. If you think about it, news media people who, especially local news, are really perfect candidates. They're well-trained, very capable of speaking eloquently on a topic, very easily delivering succinct points, really perfectly designed to be credible politicians. Also, local news is generally still quite respected, at least in the United States and where I'm from. People may not like Fox News or CNN or MSNBC, but to some degree, they usually like their local media figures a lot more. I know there's definitely a lot of respect and trust with local news media. We saw several candidates, Ron Chetty running as one. Also, Ashley Hinson in Iowa ran an effective campaign in that district. And if you look in the past, Rebecca Kleefisch, who was the former lieutenant governor of Wisconsin, also was a former journalist before she became a politician. So I think from a credibility level, it's an interesting choice. I don't know if it's a good thing or not, though.
Well, I was going to go off on Eric's point here. You can't forget Maria Elvira Salazar.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
In Florida 27. Not only did she outperform in 2018, by a lot of our margins. She then overperformed by all of our expectations again in 2020.
Yeah.
That was enough that she won that seat for Republicans. So, I mean, there's certainly factors that show that in the right area and with the right person, having that local news connection can work.
Now, there were candidates.
I don't know if it would work if someone like Don Lemon would run for office. I don't know if that would work. But I think when it comes to local news, I think there's a different connection there that works a whole lot better.
And one other one I want to note is it's not always successful. Oklahoma, I think, had a notorious example in the last cycle. I can't even remember the Senate candidate's name, but she was a local journalist in Oklahoma City, and that campaign really didn't go anywhere. There are some states where that's just not going to work in, but a more competitive state.
Oklahoma.
Yeah, again, yeah. And also, like, her opponent refused to debate her, and she spent most of the campaign complaining about not being able to get a debate. But barring that, like, they're really journalists are really television journalists are really well tailored to be politicians. Like, if you listen to Ashley Hinson speak, listen to Maria Salazar speak, they are very, very good at what they do, and that does apply to being a politician as well.
The only problem, I mean, Oklahoma's a good example. It's just the days of Dan Boren winning all but 2 precincts in the whole state from the 90s are over in Oklahoma. But to quickly answer 2 questions here. First, someone asked, could Ron Chetty have won if he had received significant investment? I think the race could have been even closer if he had received more investment because he barely received any outside spending in proportion to Bernalillo. But I think an outright victory would have been difficult considering we're still talking about a Biden plus 11 state. But briefly, if you want to look at the Open Secrets page, which is a great website for results here in terms of money raised and spent, the most important thing here is outside spending because that kind of pertains to the question. But honestly, Mark Ronchetti really didn't receive any outside spending and support. I mean, again, Ben Ray Lujan pretty much ran the campaign like he had it in the bag for the whole campaign. And then at the end, the Democrats really just went on an ad blitz of outside spending to shore it up and make sure that everything was okay there. But even in total raised and spent, I mean, he was significantly outspent in total.
Yeah.
And
I believe Joe has something to say here, actually.
Oh, sorry. I didn't see. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got another update for Kornacki here. He just tweeted out, for reference, November, Bernalillo's election day turnout accounted for only about 10% of the votes cast in the county. Based on the numbers that Kornacki is seeing, he is saying that it will be about 27% of the total votes this time. So I don't know whether that's what I don't know. We don't really know whether that's how that's going to really affect things, but that's just something to think about when you're looking at the numbers tonight.
And that would be good for the Republicans if you look at it, because if you compare the percentage of the election day vote against the early vote, the Democratic lead in the election day vote in Bernalillo or in the district as a whole is significantly smaller than in the early vote as a whole. But just so we can get it back to the panel real quick, I wanted to answer this: what would be considered high turnout? So I did some numbers here again, and I'll just read them to you because it's pretty simple here. So in the last election, you had 321,000 votes cast total. Honestly, given the early votes right now, I think we're at or about or over 100,000 if you look at the early votes and election day votes. So overall, I mean, that's approaching 150,000. And if the election day votes that we saw so far are, as Joe said, only 20% of the total, then we could very well see exceeding 150,000 tonight, which would be pretty good for a special election.
Mm-hmm. And I think someone mentioned in the comments that in regards to just going back to the Senate race real quick, another one that was a little bit closer than the presidential was the race for Senate in Minnesota. But again, one factor there that was not in New Mexico was the presence of the Legal Marijuana Now Party, which seemed to have had the effect of peeling off a lot of Democratic voters down ballot. That was not a factor in New Mexico this time. New Mexico was really a 2-candidate race. So that was a little bit of a different factor there. Which is odd because New Mexico has actually been a little bit more favorable to third-party candidates lately. Mainly, although granted, all of them have been named Gary Johnson, who was a former governor of the state.
Yeah, so again, we've got about 8 minutes left, according to what Joe set up with Kornacki there, until polls close, and we'll be waiting eagerly to get those results in. And I guess just to fill the time, as I mentioned earlier, looking at the percentage of the total combined early votes and election day votes from our 5 p.m. report, again, Democratic makeup is 45% of what it was in November, Republican 33.9% of what it was in November. But since we saw this pattern around the whole country, and even in this 5 p.m. data for Republicans to be doing better in the election day vote column, if, like Joe said, it turns out to be correct that the Bernalillo County early vote only accounts for 20% of the total vote, that could be better for Republicans than some individuals have been predicting, in that it should boost that Republican percentage up to the point where it's closer to the Democratic percentage in terms of that roughly 45% threshold when you're looking at the percentage of the votes cast now from the total cast in 2020. And Joe and Kraz, feel free to mention anything you want to mention, and pretty much about anything with the race.
Yeah, so I was going to say, I think one thing we've talked about a little bit, but I don't think it's been brought up, is kind of why Moores really never generated any kind of serious, sustained buzz. I know at the beginning he was considered a strong candidate, and we think, overall he probably still is relatively strong. But I think it's interesting that back in 2017, we had Democrats running in districts just this red, state legislative races, congressional races, like the one down in Kansas, the one down in South Carolina. And there was a lot of hype about them. There was heavy fundraising. There was poll after poll. And Moore's never really generated that kind of buzz for Republicans. And given that he flipped a Biden +3 state legislative district, that was kind of surprising to me. I think there are probably multiple factors going on here. This is a blue trending district. It's one where, the Democratic margin has gotten better and better every cycle. So it's, maybe it's just a factor of Republicans don't see it as trending towards them. It's been away from them for a while. So they might view it as just too tough of a hill to climb. But also Moore's kind of never really ran the campaign that seriously. He's only raised, I think like $40,000 or something. I mean, very little money.
I'll double check real quick. I'm curious as well.
Yeah, he spent very little. He's raised very little. He spent very little. And also, Moore's just hasn't, really seemed to, engage in a serious way like he actually thinks he can win. I think he made some comment where he gave kind of a dodgy answer to the question, did Biden win the presidential election? Which I don't think had too big of an impact on this race, but you're running in a Biden +23 district, just answer yes. I mean, you got to just say yes. So I think partly his instincts and partly just there wasn't a lot of fundraising here. So
yeah, and I think that sends conflicting signals, because at the same time earlier in the campaign he said Biden's the president and we have to work with him. So it's almost like a two-faced move there. But again, I think it's a great point. I mean, Kyle Kondik, who analyzes House races there, the deputy editor at the Center for Politics, mentioned this earlier. He was talking about just 4 years ago with the Georgia 6 special election, with then John Ossoff really making his debut before obviously becoming a senator. That was the most expensive House special election up to that point, and remains so. I mean, millions of dollars were spent. This race has only attracted like 1.5 million in total spending, not 60 plus million.
Yeah, if this were not a Biden, if this was more like a Biden +5 seat, like a Minnesota 2, something closer along that line, or a Rust Belt seat, something that's trended Republican, I think it would have been more competitive. One thing that really did help is Democrats didn't have a disaster of a candidate. Melanie Stansbury had a gaffe when she said she supported the Breathe Act, but she was able to get out of it by basically saying she misspoke and meant to support another act. Other than that, she's been running a fine campaign. If they had nominated the other candidate, who was a more progressive candidate, it could have been more of a problem here, because New Mexico is one of those states where the abolish the police sort of comments didn't really work that well, to put it lightly.
So I guess the four of us, can we give any personal predictions here about what the margin is going to be? We can go around the board.
I guess I'll start here. I'm gonna go with a D +18. I think on the margin tonight.
I'm gonna go with D +16. Feeling lucky.
Kraz?
Yeah, I'll stick with our poll D plus 16, but it wouldn't, given the early vote numbers, and I don't like analyzing early vote numbers that much, but given the early vote numbers, I wouldn't be surprised if the Democrats run it up and we kind of underestimated them. But I'll say I'll be different from Harrison, so I'll say D plus 18.
D plus 18 is fair.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to bring up something here just about what Kraz mentioned about, in some of these special elections, last time you mentioned Kansas 04 and you mentioned Georgia 06. But, in those elections, you had those in areas where there are people in there who are, in districts that had areas that were trending towards Democrats. You had Wichita in Kansas 04, obviously the Atlanta suburbs in Georgia 06. Like we've mentioned, we really don't have that here in New Mexico. We really don't have that here in Albuquerque. This is like we just mentioned, this is a Democratic trending district here, and this is not necessarily an easy place. So that might be another reason why we haven't really seen that type of hype surrounding it, because sometimes a special election is just boring. Just kind of how it is sometimes. They're not all exciting, they're not all big, but it's kind of what it is sometimes.
Well, and also if I can jump in on this a little bit, Aaron Goldsmith again asked a really good question in the comments. He said, is the lower buzz possibly just a symptom of a Republican Party struggling to find an identity post-Trump? This is definitely a possible explanation. I think it definitely plays a role in it, right? With Trump off Twitter, with Trump out of the White House, you've got a Republican Party that is kind of trying to figure out where it is right now. But I think more so, there are a couple factors that gave Democrats a lot of buzz in 2017 and 2018 that aren't there for Republicans. Post 2016, Democrats were in an all-out sprint 24/7 to try to flip as many seats as humanly possible. Obviously, many Republicans are very upset with the Biden administration for a variety of reasons, but I don't think that kind of like fresh, hot, white hot anger is really there in the same way it maybe was for Democrats in 2017. Furthermore, back in 2017, 2018, there emerged kind of a conventional wisdom from Democrats that, hey, look, Hillary lost Wisconsin because she didn't visit Wisconsin. She lost Michigan because she didn't visit Michigan. If we just send campaigns to these places, whether it's Kansas, whether it's South Carolina, if we just send campaigns to these places and, we run, people from the district, we run locals, we can win wherever we want. We can win wherever. Doesn't matter how red, we can win. And they had some good performances, but I think there's kind of been more of a conventional wisdom to emerge in the last 2-3 years that parties have recognized. Elections are very polarized, and so there really isn't the same kind of hope there. I think just because of what we know now about polarization and the way it's gone.
Mm-hmm. Briefly, just as quickly as I can before we get results here. Someone asked, could either of the two special elections in Ohio be competitive? I'm still covering the special elections. The 11th district, where you have the Shontel Brown Nina Turner primary, that is not flipping. It's a VRA seat. It went to Biden by 70 points. That's safe Democratic in our book. The 15th district was like 56-42 Trump, so you can see a somewhat more competitive race there. I wouldn't say a flip. I'd say either, if not safe Republican, likely Republican. Although Allison Russo, a state representative on the Democratic side there, is a pretty good candidate, I will say. We have to wait and see, but definitely the best recruit the Democrats could find, but still, again, likely Republican.
Yeah, and that seat is trending Republican as well. This has only trended Republican since 2008. It's not a if this were a Trump second term, that would be a seat that would be more viable. But you don't see those sorts of seats flipping in these sorts of presidencies for the other party.
And
it's just not something you see too often.
Just to quickly talk about our election schedule while we're waiting here, we do have coming up the New Jersey and Virginia primaries. We're going to have 2 separate streams for those. And then we're going to have on the 22nd coverage of the New York City mayoral ranked choice voting primary. And we also have the Jake Ellzey, Susan Wright runoff in Texas 6. In November, we're going to be covering all of the Virginia, New Jersey gubernatorial races, all the down ballot races. We're probably going to do 2 separate streams again, since those are the 2 big states. But we'll also be chiming in on New York, the 2 Ohio special elections, And next year, we begin our 2022 coverage with the Alcee Hastings seat, which is being where you have an election in 2022 to fill that seat. So that's a pretty far off special election.
Still waiting on those first results there for a little bit here, guys.
Oh, and someone had a really good question I wanted to get back to, which was Governor Grisham in New Mexico from Jacob Smith. Actually, yes, this could be a dark horse race. Our poll, I believe, showed a 52-39 edge in a rematch with Steve Pierce, who is not a good candidate for this district. But Grisham's had a big ethical scandal lately regarding a sexual assault cover-up in her sexual harassment cover-up in her administration. I believe it was actually her who was responsible for the ordeal. That's the sort of thing that could cause a problem in a race. Although in a state that's as democratic as New Mexico is right now, we're not sure.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, Republicans would need a good candidate there, and this Grisham stuff would need to hold on for another year or two. But this is not the sort of headline you want. And the fact that the potential race there is much more competitive. Again, our polls show this being an 18-point lead for Stansbury, or a 16-point lead.
Mm-hmm.
For that to only be a 13-point lead and only being 52-39, that's really bad. Keep in mind, this district's about 3 points to the left of the state overall, 3 to 4 points. So that would indicate more of a, if that's a 13-point lead, that's more of like a within 10-point race. That is verging, not necessarily, likely Democratic, but leans Democratic territory as well. This would be one of the better Republican stretch targets, in my opinion. Assuming the scandal holds up, assuming there's not a resignation or
we don't
resolution to the
nominate,
thing.
Steve Pierce to run.
Yeah. If Ron Chetty were to run, that would immediately be a very credible campaign, in my opinion.
It would, because Pierce is basically a perennial candidate at this point.
Yeah.
With all due respect.
Pierce is really popular in the. Oh, we got
Joe, ready?
Yes,
Alrighty.
we finally have the numbers. The Washington Post is reporting numbers.
The New York Times.
The Santa Fe part of district, only 1% of precincts in, but in this singular precinct, Mark Moore's is up 540 votes to 342 on Melanie Stansbury, which puts it at 58-37. But again, this is likely a slightly Republican tilting precinct in Santa Fe part of the district.
It may actually be the whole portion, because in 2020 only 3,000 votes were cast here, and we're at like 1,000, so that could be the whole Santa Fe County.
Yeah, I see some Republicans in the chat saying to stop the count.
I'm going to screenshot this as a memory.
So this may be the only time you see Mark Moore's lead the vote total tonight. So savor this moment, Republicans.
Actually, I do have one question on this. Can anyone tell me, because these might be almost complete results from this county.
They are, pretty much.
They are, yeah. So I actually do wonder, what were the results in this county in 2020?
Oh, here, I have them up. Let me show. Okay, so in it.
This is Santa Fe County. So this is the Santa Fe County portion.
64. It was 128. Holmes won it by 28 points.
And what's the margin here? 25 for?
Yeah, 25.
So initial sign not looking to
and again, just for the viewers here, in the Santa Fe portion last time, 3,200 votes were cast total altogether. Here, according to the New York Times, 931. Given the fact that total turnout is roughly 40% of what it was in 2020, that 900 votes could be all the votes in this portion.
Yeah. And keep in mind, Aubrey Dunn is polling about 5% here. Manning is not polling as well, but 5%, 4.6% for Dunn is actually pretty credible and would be an indication of him peeling off some of those Republican voters. For those who aren't familiar with Aubrey Dunn, he was elected as a land commissioner statewide, then flipped in the middle of his term to the Libertarian Party, now has become an independent. So a lot of political transformations in the last few years for Aubrey Dunn. But he is running here mainly with the goal of screwing Republicans, and it seems like he's doing a pretty decent job of that.
Joe, what's up next?
I just want to. It's no important updates to the actual results, but I do want to say that just came across my feed from JMC Analytics, John Coulion. The 36% was the same that Deb Haaland got in 2020. So that about matches up with what Deb Haaland got. Of course, with the added twist of Aubrey Dunn getting 5% in this race, which that kind of adds its added twist. But Stansbury about matching what Hollande got percentage point wise.
That's a
Steve
good point.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention the third party impact. That's good.
Yeah, Steve Kornacki saying that it's 61-39 right now, and in November it was 62-38. So very, very, very minimal swing from this area.
Yeah, and not that I'm an expert in this, but looking at the live map from our friends at RRH Elections, it does look like this is every single precinct in the Santa Fe County portion of the district. Now, of course, caveat with that is that this might not be all the votes from those precincts. So we still be on election day votes or absentee votes or anything like that. So just obviously the caveat we've been giving for a while now, but this does look like this is some combination of every single precinct in the Santa Fe County portion of this district.
Okay, go ahead, Joe, and then I have a comment afterwards.
Yeah, I do have some results. Our good friends at Decision Desk HQ have dropped some of the first results from Sandoval County in this district, and it has done pretty heavily for Melanie Stansbury in these little first updates here. About 4,400 votes in Melanie Stansbury won that 63-33 over Mark Morris, with Aubrey Dunn taking about 2.3% of the vote, and Christopher Manning taking about 1.2% of the vote so far. In that part of that is this is in the part of Sandoval County that is in the district. So 63-33 right now in favor of Stansbury.
Briefly, to touch on Santa Fe, and this is a comment I wanted to make earlier based off of what Kraz said. So again, the Democratic numbers that I saw earlier today are 45% of what the turnout was in November district-wide. So I'm using that 40%, 45% as a benchmark for overall turnout. And at the moment, the total votes cast in Santa Fe are 28.6% of what they were in the last election. So I estimate if we want to get it up to that 40% mark, that leaves about 15% to go, and 15% of that would be roughly 400, 500 votes left in Santa Fe to come in. So if I had to guess, the election day votes would probably number that amount, maybe a little bit more, but probably around 500 votes still out in Santa Fe. Most of
Do we know which precincts are in from New Mexico 1? I have my precinct document that I have with those Sandoval County precincts here that I can take a look at and
we
compare.
do actually know at the moment. In Santa Fe, precinct 73, 115, 84, 125, and 15.
Just send it to me in the private chat or in the public chat, and we can, that way it'd be a little bit easier for me. I'm trying to make sure I find the right document here.
I will also say, according to one of our comments here from Tyler Allen, it seems that Steve Kornacki is saying that this result right now is early and absentee ballots only. So there's still election day votes to be counted. So that probably means that Moores will end up clocking in a slight overperformance in this portion of the district. Don't know if it'll hold the other portions, but obviously it's not a great sign that he's only running slightly ahead of Trump.
And again, we're looking at 500 votes out potentially.
Yeah, so let me take a look at these precincts here. I'll have to calculate the results here on the fly because I do have the totals here. But mainly what I'm interested in was around Chetty. That's the one that's going to be the most interesting. If these are the early votes, we would expect the actual day votes to come in a little bit sooner, or to be a little bit more. I should say to be more favorable to Republicans.
Looking at Sandoval briefly while Eric's getting that data up, about 70%, looks like 65% of the total has come in. Keep in mind that Sandoval cast about 13,000 votes in 2020.
15.
Right now it's at what appears to be about 4,500 votes cast, and given the turnout drop, that probably means we're only looking at about 1,500 or so more votes left in Sandoval, given the fact that about 2/3 of the total votes are reporting.
Actually, those are in Santa Fe. I may not be able to get this done by the time the results come in. Oh, actually, these are all of the Santa Fe precincts. So this is all of Santa Fe.
Yeah, we don't have Sandoval in yet.
Yeah, so all of Santa Fe appears to be these appear to be all of the precincts from Santa Fe. If this is what I'm seeing, because you listed 5. Yeah, you listed 5 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So so let's compare the numbers right here.
Okay. And just to answer this question, I'm fairly sure that New York Times count for Sandoval does include in-person and early vote, considering that the 65% in numbers at about 4,500 votes line up with the turnout math I've been doing on my document overall. So sounds good there. Joe?
Very small update here, but it looks like we've got those early vote absentee numbers in from the part of Valencia County that's in here. It's broken slightly for Mark Moore's 49 to 46. Again, these are very small numbers here. That's 223 to 210 in the terms of total vote count. But Moore's in the absentee currently leading in that Valencia part. I don't know how that voted in 2020. But in the early absentee right now, Moore is currently leading by about 3 points.
And that's interesting. The Republicans won the Valencia portion by 6 points in 2020 in the House race there. And before that, it had backed Democrats pretty much exclusively.
Yeah. And so just looking at what I had seen, this is for Ron Chetty. So keep in mind, this is the best Republican performance in Santa Fe in all likelihood. Ron Chetty carried that portion 65 to 33 last time. And right now, Moore's is up in the Santa Fe portion. 58, or actually, yeah, this. Sorry, go right ahead, Joe.
Yeah, waving big hands because I have seen numbers. Looks like some potential early vote numbers from Bernalillo County. Melanie Stansbury leads 64 to 32 over Mark Moore's in Bernalillo County. According to this, that's come across my feed here. I'm guessing from the New Mexico Secretary of State website. 64-32. For Stansbury over Moore's in Albuquerque. And again, what I expect to be the early vote so far for the district.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so what I was just going to say is it looks like he's running a little bit behind in Santa Fe, but again, that's probably to some degree due to these being early votes. The later vote could change, although again, we don't know how much of the election day vote is going to come from here.
Yeah, so just to chime in on this a little bit, according to one of the comments earlier, it looks like Bernalillo County cast, I think, 86,000 votes combined absentee and like early in person and absentee. And this result appears to be about 80. Yeah, actually, almost exactly 86. It's a little bit less, maybe 85,000 votes. So this appears to be the early and absentee dump from that county, if I'm doing the math correctly, which I think I am. But yeah, so it appears to be that.
So basically, if this is the early voting, and then we assume the later ones come in, I think this would probably not be the D+24 performance we're looking for, because right now it's D+19. If this is the early votes and all of them from Bernalillo County, then we would assume that the election day voting would be more Republican than this and would not increase that margin, and especially given what we know.
If it means anything. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. What do you say?
Well, I was gonna say, I don't know if it's only D+19 or if that number is behind, because the numbers I'm seeing have
gotcha.
Stansbury +32 in
Gotcha.
and that would make her about probably like +28 in the whole.
No, she's +19, and the district as a whole right now it's 57. According to the Washington Post, it's probably behind 57.8 to 38.5.
Yeah,
so that we're talking district wide here. Yeah.
But although briefly,
although if those numbers don't really jive with, actually, I'm going to check the New Mexico website.
Kraz, did you say 86,000 total in Bernalillo?
Yeah, 89.
Or is that district? That's just Bernalillo, right?
Yeah. It's not district wide.
So that would be alone on its own. That would be 29% of the total votes cast in Bernalillo last year. So
yeah,
for a trivia point.
Yeah, because I'm seeing her +32 in Bernalillo right now, and that would be. I don't think it's really possible for her to only be +19 district wide if she's +32.
The Citizen Desk has updated with those Bernalillo early votes, and that has it right now at Stansbury +31.
Yeah, so we're looking right now 64 to 32 according to the New Mexico website. So if that's the case, we're about 88,000 votes in. I don't know how many election day votes were left. We assume this would probably push the total up a little bit, but it does actually skew a little bit more towards the better Democratic performance side of things.
So this is kind of funny, but it appears if the live map here is actually working properly, it seems that hold on. Let me make sure the live map's refreshing because don't want to say something incorrect. Give me 1 second.
And yeah, for those who are wondering, we can call this race for Melody Stansbury. I don't think that should be any surprise. We basically called it before the stream was even up. But yeah, she's going to win this race by a wide margin, as expected.
Oh, yeah. Steve Kornacki just dropped a tweet. He said, so the early absentee is Stansbury plus 32. And in November, the early absentee in Bernalillo County was 60-40 Democratic in the House race. So right now, Stansbury is outrunning Hollande by, 12 points in the early absentee vote. Now we'll see how this goes in the election day vote. But remember, at least according to the updates from the New Mexico Secretary of State, the election day vote in terms of party registration was only about 25 points more Democratic than the early absentee vote, which is a lot, but it's going to make up a very, very small percentage of probably the overall vote. So it's looking like Stansbury may actually bring home for Democrats a larger win than expected.
Yeah, and if you look at the RRH numbers comparing the 2020 House against 2021, I'll just share my screen briefly so you guys can see the physical decline. And again, we're still waiting on election day votes out of Bernalillo. But if you want to look over here, and this mixes about with a 17-point win in Bernalillo County or so. But as you can see, 2020 House to 2021, there's a decline. Moores is clearly not hitting the numbers that Holmes hit in the county at the moment. Mm-hmm. And there's no use even showing my benchmark because the benchmark was meant to show the implications of a Republican getting over 40.7% or over Holmes's margin in Bernalillo. And if Moores can't do that, unless the election day vote save him, but if Moores can't do that, then we're looking at a margin bigger than we expected earlier. And 2020 House. So something interesting here. I'm not sure. We're still waiting on some stuff out of the Valencia portion, so I'm not going to show that yet because I want to wait. But any updated thoughts, guys, on the race based off of what we've seen?
Yeah, it looks like sorry.
So so far we've our poll certainly has hit Mark Moore's margin so far in what we've gotten so far, but certainly Stansbury. Certainly getting a lot more than what our poll was showing. But we're going to see here, obviously, again, we're going to start to see election day vote trickle in here in some of these states. We're going to part of the county. And we're going to see if that moves the needle at all. Mm-hmm. I doubt it at this point. We're probably going to see, I can say anything, probably about Stansbury plus 25 to 28, I'd say. Certainly a very disappointing result, I'd say, for Mark Moores.
If I can chime in with that a little bit, I think Stansbury is going to stay above 20 here. It's D plus 31 right now. We expect the election day vote to make up about 1/4 of the overall vote. If the election day vote is 40% more Republican in terms of margin than what we've seen so far, that will only cut her margin by then 10%, right? It's only 1/4, 40% more Republican, only cut it by 10%. So you kind of see the hill Moores has to climb here to even get it under 20%. So I don't really see. It's possible he can cut it under 20, but I don't really see that as super likely.
Mm-hmm. And even looking at the Bernalillo margin here, if you want to look at it, Mark Moores is at 33%, which that does mesh with our Republican floor there in our poll, but we're still looking at Stansbury far outrunning that 49% that we had there. So our undecided clearly went to Stansbury, plus the fact that both third-party candidates, Aubrey Dunn and Christopher Manning, underperforming slightly. But so far, I would say that our 16-point margin, at least once we start to get election day votes in, will prove to be fairly accurate. Because, again, I highly doubt Stansbury will keep a 30-point spread over Moores once we get that election day vote coming in, considering the discrepancy. And there was a visible discrepancy. Republicans had the Democratic tally a lot narrower in the election day vote than they did with the early vote and absentee.
But again, we'll keep watching and see how this adjusts. Obviously, we have called the race. This is a comment here. We think it's actually pretty typical for third party candidates to do less, to perform more poorly than they did in polling. This applies to pretty much any race, pretty much ever. Polls tend to overestimate third party candidates for some reason. People say they support, a guy, and when they get to the ballot, they decide to vote for one of the two who can win. I think that's just a psychological thing. But yeah, that's not exactly surprising in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. What was kind of interesting about our poll, though, and I think maybe we can look back at this later, is when we ran the poll, the candidate who had, or the group of voters, who were breaking third party and who were more likely to, say they were voting for another candidate or say they were unsure, were Trump voters, 2020 Trump voters. And so while it looks like we might get, Moore's margin or Moore's percentage pretty accurate and the overall margin pretty accurate, it's interesting that, we thought he might have had room to grow, given that something like 15% of Trump voters in our poll were going for third-party candidates or going or undecided. And the third-party vote seems to have completely evaporated. And yet he really hasn't gained above where we thought he was going to be. So I think that, I think this is probably a good result for Democrats if this holds.
Yeah. And again, the Democrats here are really saying two things. First off, obviously they've won the race. That was really not really ever in doubt. The margin was really what was in doubt, especially after the combined Texas 6 electorate, which now I think this proves could not be compared at all with this because they're completely different animals looking at the results. And we're still waiting on election day vote. But even with, as Kraz said, an extremely good election day vote, it's still not going to be the same animal as Texas 6. But if we're looking at the district as a whole here, the Democrats obviously looked at Biden's 23-point margin and said, this is a good thing we'd like to hit, a good benchmark. So if it can stay around that area, anywhere between, Holland's 17-ish point margin in her last House race, which is obviously not in doubt at all. I mean, this Bernalillo performance is not on track to hit less than 10% margin, let alone 17% margin. So I'd say 20% is a fair bet at this point. And either at or above that 23% from Biden could be possible, which would be a success for the Democrats. Mm-hmm. And certainly a little bit of a blow for the Republicans. But like Kraz said, Moore's really, I mean, look at the 2017 cycle lead up to the 2018 midterms. Not necessarily saying this is a doomsday thing for Republicans in the midterms because this election really didn't get much attention, but Georgia 6, Montana, South Carolina 5 all had Democrats doing well in exceedingly Republican districts. But granted, all of those candidates got more attention, which is why you had successes like in Pennsylvania 18 with Connor Lamb. So I wouldn't say that it's that impactful.
No single election is doomed. No single election is doomed for either party. I mean, we just had a Texas 6 election where Democrats not only underperformed Joe Biden in a swing seat by a considerable amount, they didn't even make the runoff. So even if Republicans had made this a much more credible showing, I wouldn't have said this is doomed. I mean, you can only look at one election at a time. That being said, this does make a little bit better of a picture for us looking at these things as a whole. Because Democrats don't want to have go into an election with a special election underperformances, and so this definitely makes Texas 6 a little bit less of a devastating blow for them, I would say.
I will also say I think what it comes back to is kind of parties getting, I don't want to say smarter because I think it's good if parties can test everywhere, but I think parties have gotten a little smarter, right? Like you think about the way Democrats just pounded the pavement in South Carolina's 5th, and in Montana, and in Kansas, and no doubt they had some successes in those states. John Tester was reelected in 2018. Laura Kelly was elected governor in Kansas in 2018. But Democrats didn't really have a whole lot to show for it in South Carolina. They've consistently fallen short in Montana, apart from Tester. And on top of that, a lot of those races, a lot of these state legislative races where Democrats were investing a ton of money back in 2017, 2018, 2019 that they were able to flip, they lost in 2020. You look at a race like Connor Lamb, that was a hugely seminal moment for the lead up to the 2018 midterms. And, Connor Lamb won, which was good for Democrats. Obviously, they got a seat in the House. But if that district doesn't get redrawn by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, there's a strong possibility he loses that November. And if he doesn't lose that November, he almost certainly loses, this last November 2020. So I think parties have kind of looked at this, and I wouldn't be surprised if Democrats start doing this too going forward, and just kind of saying, look, yeah, we can generate all this hype about this district or that district that we're never going to win, but what is it? What is it going to come to? Are we going to really? At the end of the day, you just need a majority, and so I think that's also part of this now. Parties have done a little aware.
And this happened throughout the 2000s as well. I mean, you saw a ton of focus on special elections that ultimately were meaningless. I mean, I remember the South Carolina 1 special election where Democrats thought they could flip it with Stephen Colbert's sister-in-law, and ultimately went to Mark Sanford. It was really an embarrassment, frankly, in a suburban seat. Like people are getting smarter about which races to target and just not blanketly throwing things. Because in the Trump era, right, Democrats wanted to make anyone and everything Trump, and wanted to target basically every Republican possible out of this zeal of just not liking Trump, which is a pretty common thing. And he ultimately lost his reelection by a reasonable margin in the popular vote. Now that energy is not there, I don't think, on the similar side for Biden, at least in terms of trying to tie every Democrat to him. And it's just that maybe it's not wise to target a district like this.
Yeah. I just wanted to update a small little thing to a question. How much of the vote percentage-wise is expected to come from Bernalillo County? Like I said, in the last House election, about 92% of the vote came from there. So I'd say probably somewhere around 88 to 92%. Probably on the upper end, given that it's a special election and turnout's lower. And we projected it, to answer this one, we projected that State Representative Melanie Stansbury, the Democrat, as expected, will win. The bigger surprise is at the moment it looks like the margin will actually be on the upper end of things, which is, a bit more than we expected. But we'll wait and see how Bernalillo Election Day voting changes that margin.
Mm-hmm. And I actually want to add a few more things on with these special elections. Just what special elections were people doing at the start of the 2010s? What ones were they paying attention to? We were looking at things like New York, 9th Congressional District, which is New York City and was set to be redrawn. Republicans spent big to win that race with Bob Turner, and he ended up getting drawn into a Democratic seat and retiring. That was a waste of time and a waste of money, and frankly, it was not worth bothering with. That was just one of those examples. You had the Mark Sanford election in South Carolina 1, which is, that wasn't even close. That was a 9-point win in what should have been a more competitive district. You had seats in New York that were being contested. You had seats in Kentucky and Hawaii. I think Republicans were trying to contest, or there were special elections in Hawaii.
Here, I'll pull up the list for you. That might work.
I have the list on Wikipedia. Then even the start of the Trump administration, right? You have the Montanas. You have the other ones along that line. By the end of it, were they contesting New York 27 seriously? No, they were not. They were not contesting that race very seriously because it wasn't competitive. Wisconsin 7, Sean Duffy, Republican trending district. They wisely pretty much stayed out of that race. They did not support the Democrat, but they kind of ignored it. North Carolina 3, they had a choice between focusing on 3 or 9. They focused on 9. They didn't win it, but they came a lot closer than they would have come in 3. I mean, we're seeing, and on the Republican side, we've not seen anything really that similar yet, aside from this election. I'll be more interested to see if we're talking about a more competitive seat, though, the median seats. If you want to use, I'm not a big fan of Cook PVI, but if you were to look at those, median competitive districts that they have listed, the ones that are, within the D+5 column, if they had races that were up, that were like a Minnesota 2nd, which is represented by Angie Craig, a competitive seat, or maybe one of those Oregon seats that are competitive, maybe something in Illinois, like Illinois 6th congressional district. Not that would be more of a focus because it's a little bit closer, but also there's actually a history of Republicans winning in that area. Those would be more reasonable targets, I think, and Republicans are wisely staying their hand and not risking an embarrassment trying to spend a whole lot of money to flip New Mexico 2nd district or 1st district and then not even coming close.
Just a quick little funny thing here to note. It's true. Charles Zhu, I think is how you say his name. I'm not 100% sure, but
Yeah.
I remember he only won that race with 39% of the vote because you have this eternal feud in Hawaii between Colleen Hanabusa and Ed Case, which is hilarious. They literally come in at every stage of the game to screw each other over, whether it's a House primary or a primary for governor or anything you're looking at, even a Senate primary. You had Ed Case run for Senate, not against Hanabusa, but initially. And Ed Case came in this race and took 27% of the vote, which stopped Hanabusa from winning because Hanabusa finished in second with 30.8% of the vote, and that stopped the race from essentially succeeding. But when you look at the in 2010, like Eric said, kind of like Bob Turner being a bust because he got drawn out, Charles Deschutes in 2010 was one of 2 Republican incumbents to lose re-election in an otherwise spectacular year because his seat was so Democratic. The other being Joseph Cow in Louisiana's 2nd District, who got destroyed because he was representing New Orleans as a Republican.
And it's worth noting he didn't run embarrassing campaigns. He was within 5 to 10% of the vote in every race he ran. It's Hawaii. Republicans, I think, wised up eventually and decided to stop defending there.
He still got 46.7% of the vote in 2010, but in the special election, if you had combined the Democratic vote, it was like 60%. But Ed Case kind of
Ed Case got 39% of the 40% of the vote about, and the 2 Democrats got 60%.
It's a funny feud. Ed Case and Hanabusa's funny feud.
Yeah. We got a good question here from Jacob, which is, what's the partisan environment like nationally? D equals 1 to 5. It's hard to pin. Just me personally, I think we can go around the group here and talk about it. I see it as more competitive than 2020, although keep in mind, if 2020 had shifted a couple points, maybe 1 to 2 points to the right, Donald Trump would be president right now in all likelihood, and Republicans would have control of the House and the Senate in all likelihood. States like Michigan, a couple other ones that were a little bit more competitive might have flipped. You would also have had House seats that flipped. That's what Democrats are really fighting here. Even if it's a Democrat plus 2-3 year, that's still down from 2020. And on top of that, you have reapportionment, which is favoring Republican states. You have who's drawing the maps, which is mostly favoring Republicans in a lot of states. I would lean more towards that D1 plus 1 to 5 category, but we really don't know. I mean, we've had very conflicting special elections, to put it lightly. They're not really compatible
for me to really make an opinion, to be honest.
I mean, we're not even halfway through the first. We're not even halfway through Biden's first term. I mean, he was sworn in middle of January. We're at the start of June, so we're not even 6 months into this thing yet.
I'd wait till 2022.
Yeah, if I can chime in a little bit on this, on the second part of this question, I agree it's hard to pin. It's probably in that range. I think it looks to be a little bit down from 2020, but it's a little uncertain. Will it get better for Republicans closer to 2022? Probably. I mean, we've seen that in 2010, the national polls got better for Republicans closer to Election Day. In 2018, the national polls got better, for Democrats closer to Election Day. We are dealing with a very, very, very polarized environment, and we're dealing with an environment where, likely voter models, turnout models might favor Democrats more than they have in the past, at least a little bit. So again, we're dealing with small sample sizes when you want to look at, just 2010 and just 2018. It's a very small sample size. I think if I had to bet money, I think that it probably will get better for Republicans the closer we get to Election Day. They'll become more engaged. Kind of the negative headlines will maybe start to pile up for Biden. We'll move beyond what has been, a relatively successful vaccine rollout and kind of a return to some normalcy. And so I think they'll probably get better for them. But that's also far from certain. Again, we're dealing with small sample sizes and a lot of uncertainty. So we'll have to wait and see.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I would mention here,
projected Stansbury a winner.
That's a little bit belated on their part, but I appreciate their entry into the game. One thing I would mention particularly is that one thing that could galvanize more Republican voters is, again, one of those seats opens up. An example could be Wisconsin's 3rd congressional district, which is the one with Ron Kind. It's a Trump district. Ron Kind is currently facing an ethical scandal regarding one of his property holdings. If he were somehow forced to retire due to a federal investigation or resign, a special election there would likely favor Republicans and would galvanize Republican support in that
Another
area.
one Republicans could win is if, since Tom Malinowski, my representative, has committed $2.5 million in tax fraud at this point over the last year. If there's a special election, keep in mind that Tom Kean lost by about a point to Malinowski in a district Biden won by 11 points on the same day. So in a special election with lower turnout, independent of any top line, Tom Kean, given the fact that there really wouldn't be a Democratic bench to start off with, Tom Kean could just go in and sweep that up, could certainly win that race.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I would again mention is, tax evasion. It's definitely, tricky. I think the scale we're talking about, I think only Yoshi has had worse tax evasion problems than Tom Malinowski right now. But in all seriousness, it is a genuine problem. That's a seat that was very competitive that Tom Kean almost won. Like,
he's running again in 2022. So
yeah, that was what a seat Biden won by under 10 points. That's the sort of threshold for highly competitive special elections, the under 10 points. Even something like, we don't want to speculate about deaths, but again, there are, I don't think there's a whole lot of elderly congressmen in that 10 district range or 10 point range. But those are the things you have to pay attention to, mostly ethical scandals or congressmen just resigning because they want to resign. Steve Stivers resigned. Would he have any reason? No, he just wanted to. That happens sometimes.
But these situations, remember when Sean Duffy resigned owing to his new child that had been born that was having some health problems, to focus more on the family. You occasionally have issues like that as well. I also wanted to briefly mention, while we wait to know the final margin here, since we were talking about special elections where one party really invested a lot only for it to really not bear any fruit, was in what would now be New York's 27th district. Back after 2010, you had a special election where Kathy Hochul won. Now she's lieutenant governor of New York, but she initially won that race by about 5 points. Only to go around and, albeit narrowly, lose to Chris Collins in 2012. And, Collins has had his own ethics problems and ultimately resigned himself after facing a ridiculously close race given the district's partisanship against Nate McMurray in 2018.
Yeah, who later turned out to not be the best candidate, to put it lightly.
But that's just another example of a race where one party puts a lot of bucks into the race and ends up really not getting any long-term gain out of it.
Yeah. One thing I mentioned here is we got to dump in from Torres County, and I don't know if this is a reporting error, but right now Aubrey Dunn and Christopher Manning are combining for 25% of the vote in Torres County. Keep in mind, this is a small county; it's only 305 votes. But if that does hold, that would be surprising, especially given Manning is doing worse than Dunn in the rest of the district. So I would be surprised to see why Torrance County he would be doing so well.
Just for context, Torrance cast 2,300 votes in the last election, so don't expect anything big here given the fact that it is a special election. I would be probably under 1,000 votes will be cast in Torrance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you drive out west, you really get a sense of just how unevenly the population is distributed. I mean, these counties are practically empty. Geographically significant, but population-wise, not at all.
It's the West. I think someone had a great map that they had made of all the populated places in the country, and you look out east. Most of the east, geographically speaking, there's a lot more of it populated. The West, a lot of it's just barren. It's federal land. It's desert. No one lives there. What they do, it's small towns, small communities. I mean, these rural places in Arizona and New Mexico have next to no people. It's a very, very unique area, and it's not going to swing an election like this, to put it lightly.
We have a quick question here that I can speak a little bit on, and it's from UFO Talk. I have a question. In such a polarized environment, how is it that my home state governor, Larry Hogan, is so popular? So Larry Hogan is one of quite a few. Well, first, let me preface this by saying if you look at Senate races versus gubernatorial races, it is much easier to win a gubernatorial race as a member of the party that may not be the dominant party in a given state. So essentially, ticket splitting is much more prevalent in gubernatorial elections, even in, let's say a presidential year where you don't have that many races up for election. But in a midterm, much more prevalent. But someone like Larry Hogan, very similar in many respects to Massachusetts with Charlie Baker, or to the greatest extent, really, Phil Scott in Vermont, who is the most liberal Republican governor, but also the most successful in terms of being able to win and hold on to a governorship with 70+% of the vote in a
And
state.
he lifted his party to break the supermajority in the state house. Republicans have a veto, basically, in Vermont now, of all places.
Opposite, and to some extent, Chris Sununu as well. But Baker, Hogan, and Scott, great examples there. Hogan's the same way. Hogan ran against Ben Jealous, and first off, his 2014 victory.
Rain tax.
Anthony Brown. That was an upset, but people underestimated the unpopularity of Martin O'Malley retiring that year, term limited, I think. And then
let's let Kraz talk here about this because this is an interesting one.
Go ahead,
there's a lot of factors at play here. As someone who resides in Maryland, I will tell you one of the reasons Larry Hogan is able to win is because in all my years watching local news here, I think I could have watched, if I didn't follow politics, I think I could have watched the local news here for the last 4 years. I have no idea he was a Republican. Literally, I mean, everything he does has this kind of like, with COVID, he said some things, right? He was aggressive about opening schools and whatever. But pre-COVID especially, he was always such like tried to be such a nonpartisan, like, be the guy cutting the ribbons at the state fair type thing, nothing really too aggressive. He never vetoed any super polarizing bills. He never picked any fights with the legislature in a real way. Kind of understood where he was. And I think Hogan, that kind of, being able to be a friendly face and not vetoing Democratic priorities, but at the same time still advocating for, what he saw as responsible administration, restrained administration. That stuff was like catnip to white suburbanites in Maryland. I made a map of it one time, which I don't have with me right now, but I looked at the shift between the 2016 presidential election and the 2018 Maryland gubernatorial election, and obviously Hogan did better everywhere, but he was doing 50, 60, even like 70 points better in some of these precincts around Bethesda, Silver Spring, Potomac, North Bethesda, all these wealthy, affluent DC suburbs. And so I think, to answer your question, I think someone once put it like Larry Hogan is super popular because he's the Republican that the Democrats think is a Democrat. And I think that probably sums it up like pretty well. You would have pretty much no idea he's a Republican if you didn't know anything about politics here.
Mm-hmm. And keep in mind, the one thing, if you're a Democratic governor in a blue state, don't make an unpopular tax. The number one way to get yourself removed as a Democratic governor is to support an unpopular tax. In the case of Maryland, it was the rain tax, which was a tax on excess flood water or rainwater that was piling up on flat surfaces.
Same thing.
Environmentalists love the rain tax but everyone else was like, "You're taxing me for rain landing on my roof." Like, and it's a lot of money. Like, people were just confused by the concept.
It was the same thing with Jim Florio back when he was New Jersey governor. He won in 1989 very handily over Jim Corder, who was a South Jersey congressman, and ultimately he lost in 1993 to Christine Todd Whitman, pretty much solely as a result of his unpopular plan or his approval of the unpopular plan to raise taxes that screwed over all the Democrats in the New Jersey legislature just a year and a half earlier in the midterms in New Jersey.
Yeah. This is, again, when I know conservatives love to talk about how conservatives haven't conserved anything, which I think is a bit silly. One of the things conservatives and Republicans have won on is taxes. Nobody wants to raise them. Anytime they are raised, Democrats have to swear up and down that this will not apply to anyone who does not make more than $200,000, who is not even rich, super rich, that it's not going to raise money on even the rich, it's the super rich. Like, that's a pretty big win. When you're flipping states like Maryland because of a tax, that's a pretty major policy win, in my opinion, just on a personal level. Regardless of what else you think about politics, that's the biggest win the Republicans have had, is they've been able to turn taxes into a no-go, like the gas tax increase. One of the reasons we're not seeing infrastructure negotiations is, how are they going to pay for it? Like, are they going to pay for it with a user fee, which is a gas tax? Are they going to pay for it by taxing electric cars or by taxing miles driven, which is one of the stupidest taxes I've ever heard of, because it's basically tailor-made to alienate everyone. It's a tax with a transponder you put in your vehicle that tracks everywhere you go, and it also disproportionately affects the poor and truck drivers. Like, who would like that tax?
Taxes have played a role in other states as well. I mean, even in New Jersey, if you look at the 2009 gubernatorial race, obviously taxes didn't make up the bulwark to the same extent that they did during the 93 campaign, but certainly didn't help John Corzine against Chris Christie.
No, it certainly didn't. And again, that's just general guideline. What do blue state voters look at? Now, Maryland is weird because it's a very Democratic state, pretty much always has been. It's shifted from a borderline southernish sort of state with a racist sort of character to one that was dominated by African American voters in Baltimore to one that's now shifting to more of a DC voter base. Places like Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, the majority of voters there are independents. They're not affiliated with Democrats. They're a little more open to voting to begin with, but they pretty much vote for those guys just to keep their taxes relatively low, or at least competitive with the rest of the region. They're a check on the worst impulses of the Democratic Party, essentially. Whereas that's not necessarily what you see with blue state Democratic governors. People like Laura Kelly, I think John Bell Edwards, pursue a little bit more of an aggressive agenda. Yeah, red state governor. Sorry, where they pursue a little bit more of an aggressive agenda. Roy Cooper in North Carolina, they're a little bit more vocal in what they want. Whereas these red state or blue state Republican governors tend to just kind of be like, I'm here to keep your taxes reasonable and not bother you on social issues or anything that's kind of keep the Democrats from doing anything too crazy.
And sometimes it doesn't work, to be honest. I mean, John Bell Edwards has faced his fair share of opposition, but he's managed to some extent, get things to keep working. One governor who's had almost a stalemate since he entered office is Andy Beshear, given the fact that both of Kentucky's houses are super majorities for the Republicans, and he's a Democrat. And they basically it's been a stalemate between the two of them. They haven't really been able to compromise to accomplish anything big. And to some extent, not trying to knock anybody here, express any other outside opinions, but in the eyes of many individuals, compared to someone like John Bell Edwards, Andy Beshear has governed, at least in his ideals, further to the left than one might have expected. Now, he's still a moderate Democrat, but he's not quite governing to the same extent that a lot of Democrats might have expected for a Democrat in modern-day Kentucky after he beat Matt Bevin. So that race is actually coming up in 2023, so far off, but we'll be there before we know it, considering 2020 felt like it would take forever, and it's already come and gone. But to get back to New Mexico, I think, just to take a look, I think we're still waiting on a lot of Election Day votes in Bernalillo County. So, Joe, do you have any updates at all you've seen?
No, not particularly. We're about where we're at. We're still at about a 63-33 spread right now currently. Still, I think a whole lot to wait on here in terms of Election Day vote. But we're just keep on waiting here, folks. There's really not much left here to talk about.
Yeah, it's true. I thought this was a good comment since we've been talking about other elections, because I know Joe can talk a lot about Pennsylvania, but Tom Corbett notably was the first Pennsylvania governor since like 1854 to not win a second term as an incumbent. And he lost by a fair amount, Joe. I mean, right? 10 points or so in a red wave. Yeah.
Hey, I know about the gas tax, but Pennsylvania has quite a lot of public universities, and then Corbett proceeded to cut education funding in his budget. That decided to take everyone off because there are a decent amount of these colleges in very rural towns that are represented by Republicans. There might be these little blue specks, but they're represented by Republicans, and it can be kind of a tax base. So he made everyone angry with that and lost by 10 points. So that was fun. That was a fun election, I guess you could say.
Yeah, he certainly unraveled given the national environment. So according to New York Times, Stansbury has increased her lead by about 0.1%. Now is leading by like 30.1%, it looks like. Still getting more out of Bernalillo.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting here how Democrats really didn't contest this race very much. I mean, they contested and they spent more, but there wasn't a lot of national buzz. Like usually, like back in 2017, even in a district like this, you would have seen, a kind of, a cursory tweet from various organizations saying, check it, donate to the next congresswoman from New Mexico's first district. She supports XYZ. Really didn't see a whole lot of that. I'll also say that I kind of expected Democrats to be at least a little bit invested in this race just because, it's a district with a lot of Hispanic voters. And I think there's probably an opportunity for them to show, hey, that the rightward shift of Hispanic voters wasn't permanent. It was due to some unique factors. But they didn't really take that opportunity to try to send that message. Maybe that was a good decision for them. If this race had been nationalized, I mean, who knows? I mean, Republican turnout was really, really terrible, it seems. So maybe it was a good decision not to nationalize it, given that their base here is, suburban, pretty high turnout. But yeah, I thought it was interesting nonetheless.
Yeah. It does make it interesting, though, if the big race is coming up. The big races coming up were, if we're looking at these sort of things, are Virginia. And they're definitely trying to nationalize those races.
They are, for sure. But then again, this is also New Mexico's first district in an off-year special election, not the Virginia governor's race. But you're right. I just feel like the Democrats never saw this seat as truly at risk beyond maybe just spending a little bit of extra money just to make sure that it didn't slip too far. I think the Democrats were more concerned, obviously not that they'd lose the seat, but that the margin would be small enough to decrease, the national perception of the Democratic advantage going into the midterms. But we're just sitting here, we're waiting. I guess in the meantime, what we can do is, I know there's a lot in terms of developments in the 2022 races for governor and Senate in terms of declarations. So if you guys maybe want to discuss a little bit of that, because we're still waiting for election day votes, that might be interesting. Some notable stuff. Charlie Crist is running for governor in Florida. Vicky Hartzler is expected to announce her entry into the Missouri Senate race. We already have Eric Schmidt and Eric Greitens running there, and that's going to be a crowded field. There are a lot of interesting things that I think we could talk about. So do you guys have anything particular with Senate or governor at all, just to fill the time? Eric?
In which state?
Just anything that you've seen with it's still early, but any developments in the Senate or gubernatorial campaigns?
The Senate is really interesting. It seems like, obviously, some of these Trumpy candidates have been really – we'll probably end up here pretty shortly, but some of these Trumpy candidates have actually been doing very poorly in terms of, like, the ones aggressively courting the Trump, like your Josh Mandel's, not really going anywhere. Mo Davis actually has not cleared the field – or Mo Brooks, sorry, has not cleared the field in Alabama. There's other people chomping to join in. It's interesting to me that despite the loudness of that faction, the candidates who are running are not the most serious candidates, and they're not clearing the field. People aren't afraid of this. Even if you look at Texas, Donald Trump just announced that he's supporting Greg Abbott the moment after Sid Miller, one of the statewide officials, decides he's going to primary Greg Abbott. That it gives me an indication that these people maybe not their bark may be a little louder than their bite in a lot of cases, and their political instinct for that matter. Unless
you're Jody Heiss running against Raffensperger.
Yeah.
But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I think we're going to wrap it up here. You can keep following on my Twitter feed if you want results updates. But thank you again for watching. Have a good night. We'll be back to you, I think, in June for the Virginia and New Jersey dual coverage streams.
Mm-hmm. Yep.